Okay, so the recording has just started. Femke, if you want to, you can start the introduction.
Yes, so very warm welcome, everybody, and especially a warm welcome to you, Dr. Inge Brinkman. Great that you all have decided to join this lecture this afternoon. So I will give you a brief overview of this afternoon. So we will start with the lecture by Inge Brinkman. Inge Brinkman works as a professor at the African Studies Department at Ghent University, and her fields of research include African literature and African popular culture from a cultural historical perspective. And she's currently doing research on gender oral narrative, autobiographical writing, and is focusing on Kenya and Angola. So the lecture will be recorded, but in the recording the chat will not be visible. So please go ahead and chat whatever you want. After the lecture, we will have a short break of 10 minutes, so you can have a coffee or relax or stretch your legs. And then after those 10 minutes, we will have a break. We will have a Q&A session. And yeah, please go ahead, Inge Brinkman.
Thanks a lot, Femke, for the kind invitation and for welcoming me. Also a warm welcome to everybody who is attending. So I've prepared a brief, well, not very brief, but I've prepared a lecture for today, and then after the break we can discuss whatever you want to ask. Please go ahead. So let us go ahead with the lecture part. And in this paper, I want to frame Ngugi's book, Kenda Moyoru, published in 2018 and translated as The Perfect Nine. I want to frame this book in the wider history of the language debate and identity politics in African literatures. So on slide 4, you see the structure of the paper. First, I will briefly discuss languages and ethnic national identity. Then I will sort of give the formal version of the language debate in African literature, starting with Makerere in 1962. But then I will argue that this debate is much older and much more complex. And I will focus on one example of Kikuyu, but we could also have looked into other colonial contexts. And then we will move on to linking Kenyatta's Facing Mount Kenya of 1938 to Ngugi's book, Kenda Moyoru. And then conclusions and references. Okay. Maybe I'm not so sure how far you are into knowing something about the African continent, but Africa's linguistic landscape is immensely diverse. It is also changing. There are, of course, the languages that came into being on the continent itself. In fact, there's many of them. The estimates roughly range from 1,500 to 2,000. Of course, it depends a bit on what you define as a language. Apart from these many endogenous languages, there are also languages that came from outside. Arabic is an important and early example with some 150 million speakers. Portuguese has been spoken in Africa since the 15th century. And in the course of history, various creoles based on Dutch, Portuguese, English, and French came into existence. But also in the course of the 19th century, Punjabi, Gujarati, Hindi, etc., spoken by Africa's Asian communities. For example, Mahatma Gandhi was an immigrant to South Africa. And with colonialism, standards, English, French, and Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, and German to a much lesser extent, these grew in importance. At decolonization, roughly in the 1960s, many African countries opted to keep to make the former colonial language as the official language, which is not so logical. If as a country you want to break with colonialism, establish a new independent state, you would expect countries to opt for an African language and not the language of colonialism. Partly this was a pragmatic choice. And most educational services, the judicial system, political administration, etc., these were all set up in colonial languages. And furthermore, it was difficult to choose between the various African languages in one country. Next slide, please. But this remark about the difficulty to choose was connected to a long-standing colonial evaluation of identity categories. In the colonial assessment, Africa had tribes, and I should like to put those between commas because they have a history. But in the colonial mindset, these tribes were static, ahistorical entities in which people always looked back to tradition, and they behaved in uniform ways according to long-standing tribal customs. These were examples of primitive rule. Tribes were seen as politically not good because while they were internally uniform, they were regarded as externally inherently divisive. It's not for nothing that tribal warfare is a collocation in media and other discourses on Africa. Still, in the colonial idea, Europe, in contrast, had nations. And nations, in this view, are modern, they are dynamic, they are future-oriented. In the nation, there is room for negotiation, for minority rights, and between nations, cooperation can be established. There's even a League of Nations, the United Nations, etc. This, the nation, is good. It's civilized. These ideas were widespread when African countries became independent, and so much emphasis was put on nation building. The idea was even the tribes would disappear. Modernity would see to that. Next slide. Now, when it comes to the language of literature, we see a number of connections with this line of colonial thinking. And the problem is that such thinking is even continued in the post-colonial theory, as Karen Barber already pointed out in 1995. In this assumption, African languages are always used for oral literature. And this oral literature is regarded in folkloristic ways. It is traditional literature. It's static, it's backward-looking. The assumption is also that it will disappear. And so very often in texts you encounter this genre is still being performed. It's as if that is not what is to be expected. This African language oral literature is also assumed to be apolitical. It's innocent folklore. And it can be interpreted ethnographically. It refers to a culture embodying its values. African language literature is also associated with a limited audience based on ethnicity. The word tribe is no longer used, but there is often an immediate association between African languages and ethnic identity. While European languages are used for written literatures in this assumption. These are assumed to be modern, contemporary, dynamic, internationally oriented, critical, and having a wide national or international audience. There is a connection between African oral literature and written modern literature in that oral literature is used as a heritage and in this manner incorporated in written texts, so that these written texts become more authentic, more African. That's the assumption. Next slide. Now, the problems with this line of thinking are many. Firstly, oral literature in this scheme of thinking is only seen as a precursor to modern written literature in English, French, or Portuguese. So there is a denial of the modernity, I would prefer the dynamics of oral literatures. Secondly, this scheme does not take into account the existence of African language written literature. Thirdly, it assumes that there are Englishes, varieties of English, but it cannot conceive of a variety within African languages, a point to which I shall return. The ideas connected to language are related to the colonial assumptions on tribes and nations. But are tribes and nations, are these so very different? This is a point that John Lonsdale made. Of course, John Lonsdale pointed out there is the outer architecture of political tribalism. That refers to nepotism, ethnic divisions, etc. But Lonsdale sees political tribalism only as one aspect. There is also moral ethnicity. Through ethnic categories, people ask questions. Why are you in power? Why should we support you? Do you have any political legitimacy? What are the boundaries of political power and where does abuse start? What demands can we make as a people on you, our leaders? Now, these are questions about legitimacy and accountability. Posed in an ethnic framework, these are deep moral debates about the nature of political power. And this distinction between political tribalism and moral ethnicity should, in my view, also redirect our questions for interpreting African literatures. Next slide. Recently, in recent time, we see some new developments in Africa's linguistic landscape. For example, the importance of Mandarin is growing on the continent. We also see that several countries opt for a range of endogenous languages receiving an official status. For example, Zimbabwe, South Africa. Another important recent development is that in some formerly French-speaking strongholds, now English is gaining in importance, also at the institutional level. Cases in point are Rwanda, Congo, Morocco, etc. Now, I do not know where this, what this will lead to when it comes to African literatures, but it may have consequences for the status of African language literature. So I think it would be interesting to dive into the debates on language and African literature. Next slide, please. The first vignette. The year 1962. The place, the prestigious Makerere University in Uganda. The scene, a choice of African writers from various parts of the continent gathers to hold a conference, significantly entitled the Conference of African Writers of English Expression. Among those attending, Chinua Achebe, Zakayo Mfashlele, Langston Hughes, Okot Pipitek, and students from Makerere University, such as, then still, James Ngugi. A year later, one of the participants in the conference, Obi Wali, published a famous essay, The Dead End of African Literature. And in it, he held that literature written in the colonial languages should not be classified as African literature. Only literature written in African languages would qualify for that label. Next slide. These events are usually taken as the start of the debate about language and African literature. Generally, the argument has been represented as one between the very famous Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe, as opposed to the also very famous Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Ngugi largely agrees with Obiwali. He views English as Europhone. It's imperial, foreign language that was imposed on Africans during the colonial era. And in his famous essay, Decolonizing the Mind of 1986, he adopts an interpretation in which the assumed harmony of his youth, when there had been linguistic unity, had been broken by colonial education in English. In his view, the policy of imposition formed part of a deliberate program to destroy African languages and cultures and to colonize the minds of African peoples. According to Ngugi, this colonial project did not end with decolonization. It was continued and it was even completed and normalized in the post-colonial period. Ngugi is not a man of words alone. Since the end of the 1960s, he has undertaken numerous actions in line with this thinking. For example, as lecturer at the University of Nairobi, he played a key role in changing the Department of English into the Department of Literature. He left Christianity, he changed his name from James Ngugi to Ngugi wa Thiong'o. He started a theatre project in Kikuyu in his home village, Kameredu, and this evoked strong reactions from the Kenyan government. Ngugi was detained without trial and the theatre razed to the ground, and after his detention there was little other option for him than to leave the country, which he did. And in his 1986 book, this Decolonizing the Mind, Ngugi bade farewell to English as the medium of his writing. And after that, he wrote, amongst other books, he wrote the heftiest novel in Kikuyu ever, and Murogi wa Kabowo is 766 pages or something, very huge, massive book. Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe did not agree with Obiwali or with Ngugi. He viewed African literature as consisting of ethnic literatures written in the various indigenous languages of Africa and of national literatures written in the, as he put it, the language of the erstwhile colonial power. English had been a colonial import, but so had the nation. I've been given this language, English he means, and I intend to use it, he laconically concluded. These debates continue to engage African authors. They are still, 60 years later, a source of fierce argument. But I will come to the second part of my lecture, because I want to argue that the language debate is much older, and I want to give the example of central Kenya, but also stress that many examples could be given of various language debates in Africa. So I want us to dig deeper. So I will zoom in on the particular case of central Kenya, and lo and behold, that is where Ngugi comes from. We are now on slide 13, and I will offer you a second vignette. The year 1929, the place, the independent school in Gakarara, central Kenya. The scene. A young boy is standing on guard by the roadside. He has the task to warn those inside the school in case of a nearing school inspection party. Why is he standing there? Inside the school, the pupils are engaged in learning English. As they are not yet in Standard 5, this is illegal. Colonial law forbids any student to be taught English during the first 4 years of schooling. Before 1929, English had been part of the curriculum, also for pupils beginning with the primary education, but in 1929, the British government in Kenya ruled that Swahili should be taught instead, and English only as a subject starting after Standard 4. And this caused much resentment. Political tension over this grew. Learning Swahili, the language between settlers and their personnel, the language of lower administration in the colony, was regarded as a mere waste of time. And I quote from organizers of the independent schools, the Swahili had never conquered the Kikuyu. The independent school organizers, they wanted English to be taught, the official language of the British Empire. And with this stress on English, they called in the notion of Weyavi. Usually this is translated as independence, they described in their constitution, they described Weyavi as doing one's work without someone lording over him. This second vignette obviously complicates the first. When colonized people fought to have English included in the school curriculum, were they simply mistaken? Were they running towards a dead end? The people in the two vignettes share a profoundly future-oriented notion of their projects. In both cases, the idea about a linguistic future in the educational and literary realm is connected to more than just functionalist possibilities for upward social mobilities, because we saw that they included the notion of countering domination and inequality to strive for independent decision-making and agency. Ngugi sees the use of English by Africans as a form of colonialism or neocolonialism, but Kisa school organizers felt that mother tongue education amounted to a colonial strategy of exclusion and hierarchization. And they saw Swahili as a language that would not lead them to agency. Next slide, please. Now, in his book, Decolonizing the Mind, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, he singles out one Kenyan author in particular for praise. Hakarawa Wanjau, a popular Kenyan author who published mainly in Kikuyu during his long career, he started writing by the end of the 1940s, is mentioned explicitly by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Ngugi sees Gakara as a writer thrown up by the mass political movements of an awakened peasantry and working class. For Ngugi, Gakara's very act of writing in Kikuyu, that constituted a form of resistance. Next slide, please. Yet Ngugi's enlistment of Gakara into the ranks of radical thinking is inappropriate. Gakara was not a radical, and his choice to write in Kikuyu was not related to resistance. He had always made his language choices according to the audiences he had in mind. Thus, he wrote in Kikuyu because, in his words, I write only stories or I only deal with subjects concerning the Kikuyu. He wrote a pamphlet in Swahili when he wanted to reach the colonial settlers. And he knew full well that English was needed when he wrote letters to the governor or to the queen. Next slide. In his Owatima Mdongo Moiru, Hakara warns of the disadvantage of a black European, a person who suffers from the disease of mixing languages and has a colonial rooster in his brain. Even after colonialism, he argues in this booklet, this slave chain had still remained in existence, leading to a devaluation and the next to disappearance of Kikuyu customs and beliefs. Next slide, please. But it was not the use of English per se that Gakara warned against in his booklet. As said, he'd never been against employing English when necessary. Throughout the text of Uhoatiwa Nodongo Moiru, he uses English words and phrases. He even writes that, and I quote, "All the same, we do not deny that English is one of the most important languages in the world." It is important to note that in this sentence, in this passage, Gakara uses the word kengereda, while in the rest of the booklet, he employs the word hedongo. Next slide. What was it then that Gakara was worried about? Hedongo, this word that he uses throughout the book, was not quite English, nor was it Kikuyu. Or maybe it was both. Derek Peterson described it as a hybrid language that was at once Kikuyu and English. The boundaries between Gedongo and Kingereda are difficult to draw, and sometimes indeed the term Gedongo is used to refer to English, and that's precisely the aim. I quote Derek Peterson, "By making Kikuyu look like English, readers also made the Kikuyu look like the English, entitled respect from the British government." Like Ngugi, Gakara objected to the Anglicization of his mother tongue and designed an orthography of real, true Kikuyu. Next slide. But unlike Ngugi, the problem for Gakara was not with English as an imperial or Europhone language. Gakara's concern was for linguistic purity. A real, true Kikuyu ought not to mix languages. Gakara wondered, why would spouses greet each other with "Hello darling" or "My dear" instead of a polite Kikuyu greeting? Would a son not forget his real Kikuyu name if he were consistently called "Boy one daddy," so daddy's boy? Because of Gedongo, people no longer knew the proper greetings and the right kinship terminology. So Gakara portrayed Gedongo as negatively as he could. It was used by drunkards who would swear, "Damn you," in bars. With this, I hope I have framed Kenda Moyoru, the Perfect Nine, in the broader framework of a long-standing and complex debate on language, literature and education in Africa, and more particularly in central Kenya. So I think with this, we can move to the next part of the lecture. Ngugi was not the first to change his name. As said, he was called James Ngugi, but he changed it into Ngugi wa Thiong'o. He had good reasons to mention Gakara wa Wanjau, because Gakara had already changed his name, Jona Johanna Gakara, into Gakara wa Wanjau in the 1950s. And even he was not the first. In 1938, Johnstone Kamau published a book under the name Jomo Kenyatta. The cover shows Jomo Kenyatta clad in a skin cloak and carrying a spear. The message is obviously, this is a real, authentic African, with an African name, African dress, African attire. Now, by the time that Facing Mount Kenya was published, Jomo Kenyatta had already been living in the UK for 9 years. He studied social anthropology with Bronislaw Malinowski as his supervisor. So he may not have been the most traditional African of his time, but in Facing Mount Kenya, the project, the idea behind the book, was to show that the civilizing mission of colonialism was entirely misplaced. The central thesis of the book is, in the words of Berman and Lonsdale, Kikuyu history was more civilized than colonialism. And in order to argue for this thesis, Kenyatta had to ensure that he was accepted as the right Kikuyu spokesman, the right representative of his people, and hence the traditional dress and the African name. Facing Mount Kenya gives us a harmonious and egalitarian Kikuyu society. No conflicts, all peace and harmony, all historical and still existing inequalities between men and women, between rich and poor, between powerful and less powerful. All these differences were downplayed to arrive at an idealistical portrayal. The myth of origin in the book fits in with this central thesis. The story of Kikuyu and Mombi, as it is told in Facing Mount Kenya, had not appeared until that time as a full narrative in any preceding source. Preceding sources, furthermore, always mention various myths of origin, not one. But in order to support his project, it was important for Kenyatta to portray Kikuyu people as unified. So a unified myth of origin was necessary. Furthermore, Kenyatta was keen on showing that this myth was respectable as the Christian myth of Adam and Eve. And it is obvious that in Kenyatta's narrative in Facing Mount Kenya, Kikuyu and Mombi are molded onto this biblical example. Of course, with this, I'm not saying that Kikuyu and Mombi were not mythical characters prior to the publication of Kenyatta's Facing Mount Kenya. But I am saying that myth-making was less unified, less harmonious, and much less Bible-like in oral form than in Facing Mount Kenya. Next slide, please. Ngugi may not be prone to say that his book is related to Kenyatta's Facing Mount Kenya. After all, Jomo Kenyatta was the president of Kenya when Ngugi was detained without trial in 1977. But ever since the publication of Facing Mount Kenya, the myth of Kikuyu and Mombi spread and it became widely known in central Kenya. Hakarawa Wanjau also referred to this myth in his writing. As I explained, Jomo Kenyatta had a purpose in mind when writing the narrative of Kikuyu and Mombi. And so has Ngugi in Kenda Muyoru, I believe. This is, of course, not a problem. To the contrary, the notion of an ancient, static, unchanging myth is unreal. Myth is political. The cover of the translation, the Perfect Nine, I think it hides this. This cover, aimed at an English-speaking worldwide international audience, is soft-toned. You can see it on the slide. Traditional African colors, ochre and sand yellow, sand red. It looks symbolic. Also the blurb, it uses words like glorious epic, folklore, mythology. The reviews in the press take up that message, and it is seen as an ancient myth retold. Now, of course, in the Perfect Nine, there are many ancient elements from oral genres. There are very old ogre motifs, the hair being plucked, etc. That's more than a century old. But the cover of the Kikuyu version far better shows that the book has a relevant and topical message, that the book engages in a debate. It's more reminiscent of for example, Black Panther, the Afrofuturist movie that also was released in 2018, the same year. Okay, in the next slide, I will try to look at what I view as the book's thesis. Of course, you can distill more than these, but for me, I think these are striking. Firstly, the thesis of cultural equality that is also present, as we saw in different ways in Kenyatta's Facing Mount Kenya, I think it's also very strongly argued for in Kenda Moyoru, in various ways. Firstly, of course, there's the language. The book is written in Kikuyu, and we have already discussed the language debate and Ngugi's ideas on language and equality. So I think this fits in with that. Also, by working through this particular form, Ngugi for the first time takes distance from the novel. The novel was appropriated by African writers during and after the colonial era. In oral genres, there is no such thing as the novel in Africa. But with Kenda Moyoru, Ngugi starts to experiment with narrative verse, much closer indeed to oral literary traditions. And that, as such, is a political message, I believe, but because it challenges the dominance of the Western ideas of the novel. The book also challenges the dominance of one kind of myth over another. Kikuyu myth is as respectable as Genesis, the Iliad, etc. Also at the level of contents, at the textual level, we see this thesis of cultural equality being defended. Just one example, the chalk ogre in the book is not a real person. It's a skeleton wearing a mask of human body and hair. And I quote from the translation, "Since when does chalk beauty beat black beauty?" Of course, that's about cultural equality. These elements, I believe, and we have also seen in Facing Mount Kenya, albeit in a different way. I think the thesis of gender equality is much more outspoken in Ngugi's book than in Kenyatta's book. Kenyatta mentions matriarchy, and he is careful to be silent about inequality between men and women in Kikuyu history, but Ngugi's perspective is outright feminist. The full 9 daughters are rendered as the original feminists. And through this, generations of Kikuyu, Kenyan, African and Black women that came after them. While Kenyatta, as we saw, is explicitly concerned with Kikuyu history, Ngugi is careful to draw in a Pan-African, Black and even universally human community. And the men wishing to marry the full 9 daughters, they come from all over Africa. The supreme giver, I call Ngai in this case, but this is the same, it is stressed that it is the same supreme giver As for the Zulu, Swahili, Achola, Yoruba, Igbo, Hebrews, Mohammedans, ancient Egyptians, whatever. So this is the thesis, is not an ethnic book. It surpasses the ethnic. That's the thesis. Ngugi also carefully establishes the relations between humans and their environment, directly relating his epic to the ecological concerns of our times. Last but not least, the book is also about accountable leadership, the unique qualities of the full 9 daughters, the tests that the man and the daughters have to pass, the final will of Kikuyu and Mumbi are all meant to offer tools for moral leadership. And I quote, "Look for me among those building the nation in the name of the human." I think this message is very clear. So let me try to move to the conclusions. We saw that the views on the relations between language and power were in principle similar. All the people we discussed called for equality, agency, freedom of choice, etc. But the views on the trajectories to achieve this, these were very different. Kisa school organizers stressed standard English. Achebe saw English as an appropriated language for Africans. Hakara emphasized linguistic purity, while Ngugi champions African languages. And I am positive that if we had looked in other directions, we would have found other views in this debate. So my argument is that the language debate on African languages and literatures is far older and far more complex than is usually assumed. Our post-colonial theory often glosses over such complex histories. They reduce the language debate to one of a binary opposition. And in a way, this continues the stereotypical thinking on African languages as static, local, homogeneous, oral repositories, and ethnicity as somehow not belonging to our times. But Kenda Moyoru, with its ethnic framework, is a profoundly global book. It forms part of the lively and intense debate on worldwide racial and post-colonial hierarchies, gender inequality, and the non-human turn. But it is also a tale of hard work, of cure, and of renewal in uncertain times. And in this sense, indeed, through this moral ethnic tale, questions are posed about the legitimacy of rule, the possibilities for a just society. My final conclusion, of course, is that it is high time that Ngugi wa Thiong'o finally wins the Nobel Prize for Literature. He is shortlisted every year, and we are all becoming very impatient. We are waiting for the recognition of Ngugi's work and for the recognition of African language literatures. I thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll have a 10-minute break. We'd be super happy to either hear questions from you. You can either raise your hand virtually or say something in the chat. Or if you don't feel comfortable asking questions either by just using your mic or even with the video on, then also feel free to just type them in the chat and then we'll read them out for you. But for now, we hope that you enjoyed this very interesting lecture and that you have some questions to come back.
Thanks a lot. See you in 10 minutes.
Yeah, let's reconvene at 6.